The International Committee of the Red Cross has welcomed South Africa's decision to ratifying the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. South Africa became the 22nd state to submit its Instrument of Ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to the United Nations in New York yesterday. And for more on what all of this means, I'm joined in studio by Sarah Jean Mabeza, the Regional Legal Advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross. A very good evening to you, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Globe. First of all, what's your reaction to South Africa's ratifying the treaty, and what does it all mean?
Good evening, and thank you for having me tonight. I think that South Africa's ratification was not a huge surprise for us because the South African government has been a staunch proponent of the nuclear ban treaty since its inception. South Africa has supported it and has really fought for it to be pushed and advanced since the treaty was at the negotiation stage. So not a surprise, but at the same time, an incredibly welcome development. The more states that ratify a treaty like this, the quicker and the bigger the stigma against the use of nuclear weapons will be. And I think the relevance of the South African government ratifying this treaty now is really an important reminder of the urgency of the issue. We are unfortunately seeing increased tensions between certain nuclear-possessing states, which is leading to an increased risk of use. And given this increased risk and increased urgency, South Africa's ratification yesterday was very welcome.
In July 2017, about 122 nations adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Just a year on, how is the treaty faring so far?
I think the treaty is doing very well. International treaties of this sort generally take some time to come into operation. Ratifications by states is sometimes a long and arduous process. And so I think that the treaty is doing well. I think that given the current political climate, the treaty really does need to be focused on. And this is one of the reasons that the International Committee of the Red Cross released or launched just 2 weeks ago a global nuclear weapons campaign. And the idea of this campaign was really to draw attention to the humanitarian consequences that would result from the use of nuclear weapons, and to really call on civil society, on academics, on governments, and on the general public to encourage the ratification of this treaty, particularly from the African region.
Now, Sarah, should disarmament and denuclearization be mandatory? And if so, what kind of punitive measures or sanctions should be slapped on those countries not adhering to the treaty?
That's an excellent question. Certainly for the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, disarmament, particularly nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, is absolutely vital. This is because the ban on nuclear weapons comes from the basis of international humanitarian law, the law of war. And it's very clear in the law of war that any weapon that causes unnecessary suffering, any weapon that cannot discriminate between civilians and combatants, must and should be prohibited. And nuclear weapons fall squarely within that framework. So absolutely, a ban on nuclear weapons was a very long time coming, and this treaty is a groundbreaking historic document. In terms of punishment, we're veering slightly into the political debate, where we see it being debated quite often, what should happen, whether there should be sanctions, for example. From the ICRC's perspective, as a humanitarian organization, the most important thing for us to point out is that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons, should they be used, would wipe out the world as we know it. Everything would change. And I think that's what needs to be focused on at the moment.
You know, and some of the nuclear states are not fulfilling their legally binding obligation to disarm. But then in North Korea, as a case in point, there's still uncertainty with regards to disarmament and denuclearization. And we just reported earlier on that President Donald Trump and his North Korean counterpart Kim Jong-un have now arrived in Vietnam with regards to disarmament. And the jury's still out whether that meeting will yield any fruit. I mean, such delays are really sabotaging the efforts of the treaty, aren't they?
Yes, I think that efforts such as bilateral discussions that take place between two states, particularly states that have nuclear arsenals, are very interesting. Bilateral treaties and multilateral treaties between such states are very interesting and can be very useful. For the ICRC, regional denuclearization is a key aim, and that really does have to be emphasized. But at the end of the day, because of the catastrophic consequences that any nuclear detonation would have worldwide, for us as an organization, global denuclearization is what's absolutely key.
And other nuclear nations, for instance Australia, have made it categorically clear that they will not be joining this treaty. Will this perhaps pull the brakes towards a world free of nuclear weapons?
Some say that a world free of nuclear weapons is a very ambitious objective. But some of those same people said exactly the same thing when the international community tried to ban cluster bombs, or when the international community tried to ban landmines. Today, both landmines and cluster bombs have such a stigma against their use that even those countries that have refused to ratify the treaties prohibiting those weapons have taken a stance not to use them because of that stigma. So I think if we look at the past, if we look at how humanitarian arguments have banned certain weapons in the past despite political arguments, I think we can have hope.
All right, Sarah, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. That was Sarah Jean Mabeza, the Regional Legal Advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross.